Okay, guys, so in this last part, we're going to talk about English itself as the instructional medium. So, obviously, it's not just a simple matter of saying, let's use English. We also need to decide which variety or varieties are going to be legitimized in the process of EMI. And really, I suppose you have your two main um, kind of opposing views on this. You have the advocates of English as a lingua franca, so the non-native speaker collection of varieties, that they should be used as the instructional medium. And then you obviously have the opponents who believe that it's still important to ascribe to the norms of native speaker varieties. So if we look at the advocates for non-native speaker varieties, ELF, what are the various arguments they use in order to legitimize English as a lingua franca as a variety or collection of varieties equally legitimate to English native speakers? Well, they all operate on the assumption that it's a myth that the norms that native speakers use and have agreed and developed over a long period of time are necessary for intelligibility. So the two main researchers here that we're talking about are Barbara Seidelhofer in Austria and Jennifer Jenkins in the UK. So they believe that native speaker norms are not necessarily that important for intelligibility, that you can still be intelligible and people will still be able to understand exactly what you're saying in a communication even without adhering to native speaker norms. And really what they're trying to do in advancing this idea of non-native varieties of English is they want to try and broaden the ownership and authority to determine the norms within English to the non-native speakers. Okay, so rather than just leaving the authority and ownership of English in the hands of the native speakers, they want to broaden that to include the non-native speakers who arguably use the language just as much as the native speakers too. And in fact, because there are now more non-native speakers of the language than there are native speakers, then the argument is often made, well, why should a minority still have the power to tell the majority what they should and should not be saying? Those who also argue for ELF put forward the idea that English as a lingua franca is not a threat to multilingualism, so that when someone acquires English proficiency to a certain level, that there's still scope for multilingualism beyond just learning English. And that's the dominant discourse, really, that, you know, ELF can exist alongside multilingualism rather than replacing it. And Jennifer House here is one of the people who puts forward the idea of a language of communication versus a language of identification. So ELF, English as a lingua franca, is very much to the left here and is deemed to be a language of communication, that people do not use it as a language of identification, that they still use their L1, potentially their L2 if it's not English, as their language or languages of identification for building their identity and their multiple identities, whereas ELF is merely a language of communication that functions as a neutral medium. The problem with that is that there's been quite a few studies done, and I'm focusing here on the German context because that's the one I know the most about, that actually English is quite often used as a language of identification. Particularly in the German context, English is used as a language of identification in order to hedge German national identity. So there's still a lot of problems in Germany with people constructing Germanness, the identity of being German, and relating that to the German language and patriotism and that sort of thing. So English is often used by the younger generations in Germany to hedge their national identity. So they use English to construct a kind of a more global or more European identity that is more important to them, supposedly, than their German national identity. So ELF, or English as a lingua franca, here is more than just a language of communication. It is also a language of identification and becomes a mechanism of cultural and identity hybridity. And also it's important to recognize that yes, while these efforts might be certainly very noble and may be conducted to the benefit of the non-native speakers, it all does rely on the non-native speakers themselves accepting English as a lingua franca as a legitimate and valid variety rather than a deficient variety. And a lot of the research that's been done to date, certainly within the European context, would indicate that most non-native speakers of English do not view English as a lingua franca as an aspirational variety. They still aspire to emulate native speaker norms and learn and use native speaker norms rather than using the norms of English as a lingua franca. So then the flip side of this, our opponents to non-native speaker varieties or English as a lingua franca, they argue that the advocated approach to English as a lingua franca teaching is incompatible with everything we know about SLA, okay? So the idea of codifying something that is inherently uncodifiable in English as a lingua franca, to use that as the medium of instruction and also as the variety that is going to be aspired to by the students, it goes against everything that we know about SLA. And there's an excellent quote here from Aichon who summarizes it beautifully when he says, "The ELF approach, which suggests a degree of phonological and grammatical redundancy meant to protect the preciseness and completeness of the message, can be rightly admitted as long as intelligibility is maintained, would appear to contradict and misinterpret the nature of language learning and SLA." So the idea here being, and this is what the ELF people operate under the assumption, that a certain amount or large proportion of what native speakers use in terms of phonology and grammatical structures is actually redundant. And it doesn't actually contribute to the intelligibility of what's being said. So under this particular construct, ELF can be seen as a kind of a slightly more reduced variety where you can leave out all of these phonological and grammatical structures and still have the meaning and precise meaning of the message still intact. And really that goes against everything we understand in terms of syntax and phonology. Also, Firth puts forward the idea as well that, and again this comes back to what I've mentioned previously about ELF being uncodifiable, because ELF is a fluid phenomenon and it's characterized by high levels of variability and heterogeneity, which users negotiate on an encounter by encounter basis, making redundant the construction of an artificial variety that is inherently emergent based on the interlocutors and context. So basically, because ELF emerges within a particular context between two particular interlocutors who have different linguistic backgrounds, that is inherently a different variety of ELF that might have emerged between another two people who are interacting in another context. So it's something that is very uncodifiable as a variety because it's emergent and because it's so highly fluid. Instead of then using ELF as the medium of instruction, the legitimized medium of instruction, and also the aspirational variety within the language classroom, some people argue that there are a lot of weaknesses in focusing on non-native speaker varieties that could then impede people's abilities to communicate effectively with native speakers. Because, of course, ELF interactions, while ELF is exclusively used for non-native speaker interactions, we know that that is not the only type of interaction that takes place globally in English. We have native speaker interactions, and we have non-native speaker interactions. So it's important, instead of focusing on a non-native speaker variety of varieties as the medium of instruction or as the medium that is being learned, that rather a kind of a language awareness approach should be followed, whereby the native speaker variety norms and whatnot are still the aspirational variety, but you sensitize learners to the dynamics of the two contact situations, both native speaker, non-native speaker, and native speaker, non-native speaker. So here, obviously, two contact situations, when you're talking about ELF, refers to native speaker and non-native speaker and two non-native speakers. So in doing that, in sensitizing people to the dynamics of these kind of contact situations, it's far more effective because one pattern of communication, native speaker, non-native speaker, or non-native speaker, non-native speaker, that they do not displace one another, rather that they coexist, and that we educate learners in how to engage in the various types of language contact situations. So this particular debate surrounding ELF is very much at the heart of English medium instruction, because there's a lot of arguments out there that because many of these EMI environments don't actually have any English native speakers involved, then maybe English as a lingua franca, as a variety or collection of varieties, should actually be used as the instructional medium. And there's a lot of the arguments that we've talked about here in terms of the advocates and the opponents have exposed some of the questions surrounding that. However, it seems to be the dominant paradigm that the majority of English medium instruction programs follow the aspirational variety of native speaker norms and native speaker authority, so that adherence to the norms of native speakers appears to be the type of medium that is being used within the programs. Okay guys, so that's all for this week. Next week, as I say, we will finish off my portion of the module, looking at EMI, its challenges and issues again, but looking more so from the macro perspective, looking at two major factors: the whole interculturality and how these programs act as platforms of intercultural teaching and learning, and then also looking at them from a language policy point of view. So, to what extent are they a mechanism of, but also a challenge for language policy within an institutional context and within a national context. So we'll do that next week. In the meantime, have a good one and stay healthy. Bye guys.